This is the Venturing Angler Podcast. I'm Tim Harden. In this episode, sponsored by Loon Outdoors, we're chatting with Hogan Brown about fly fishing for striped bass on the Lower Sacramento River in California. Let's chat with Hogan. All right, we're here with Hogan Brown to talk about fly fishing for striped bass on the Lower Sacramento River. Hogan, welcome to the Venturing Angler Podcast.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me, Tim. I really appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for some time, or to at least talk about bass, and I thought it'd be good to focus our attention on the Lower Sacramento River, in part because prior to hitting record, I was already starting to learn a lot about striped bass on the Lower Sac. And so
it's not the well-known fishery that others are, I think. Yeah.
But it is well known. Yeah, I mean, I've fished the Lower Sac for trout a number of times. Salmon come to mind for a lot of people, but it is a striped bass destination.
Yeah, it really, I think if you look out as to like what it's known for, it's definitely known as a trout fishery, but what a lot of people don't realize is how the Sacramento River basically stretches half the state of California. So, it flows from Shasta Dam up into Redding all the way down to basically San Francisco Bay and the Delta. So there's, most people will say there's roughly about 80 miles up at the top of fishable trout habitat. And then there's stripers intermixed in those lower miles, but then you get below, say, the town of Corning, maybe Red Bluff. Red Bluff is about 30 minutes south of Redding, 40 minutes south of Redding, and you're pretty much a whole nother world of bass and stripers and sturgeon and all sorts of stuff all the way down to the bay. So the striper fishery is actually, if you look at it from river miles, bigger than the trout fishery, yet the trout fishery is really what the river's known for. So,
wow, I thought Corning was known for olive oil.
It is. It's the I think they're the self-proclaimed olive capital of the world, but to each their own. You got to be known for something,
right? So the upper that you just referred to, that'd be pretty close to Shasta Dam.
Yeah. The trout stretches that really are the big drift boat trout fishery is probably like right at the base of Keswick Dam, which is kind of it's the dam below Shasta. There's I guess a little lake or a holding area of water there, but basically right in the middle of the town of Redding down to like Red Bluff. But most of the trout guides and the trout dudes are fishing through the town of Redding, Anderson, and then down into kind of the little burg of Cottonwood, if you want to say like Barge Hole area where Battle Creek dumps in, and that's kind of the trout zone, I would say. So,
and then Red Bluff is about 30 miles or so south of Redding. Is that right?
Yeah, give or take. Yeah, just directly straight down I-5. So, and where we're fishing probably another 45 minutes south of Red Bluff.
Okay.
We fish probably, I would say, from the town of Corning down to Colusa. So, gosh, that's probably 100 miles,
Wow.
Maybe liberally, conservatively, it's hard to tell, but, it's a good hour drive from Red Bluff, hour 15 to Colusa, and because we'll fish, I'm thinking boat ramps, we'll go south of Colusa down to Vina and some of those areas. So it's an enormous fishery, and it's one that is really grown. I think I started going out there probably about 15 years ago. I was really and not to toot my own horn, but I was probably one of the first guys to really try to do it with any sort of regularity. what happened is we've always had a migratory run of stripers, the typical run of stripers that will come up from the bay in, March, April, and May. And they get up anywhere from Colusa to Chico. I live in Chico, which is probably about halfway in between Colusa and Red Bluff. Um, and they spawn, do their thing, and leave. And there was the few people that would, um, fly fish for those. It's a huge, conventional fishery with, massive amounts of guys that guide for it. And, they side drift minnows. It's a really big kind of annual migration of fish that really everybody gets excited about. But about 15 years ago, I was kind of at that point in my guiding career where I live in Chico and I was driving hours away from home to guide, and at times through various parts of the year living in different places. I kind of was like, I had just gotten married. We were thinking about kids, and it was like, I need to figure out how to stay closer to home. And the Lower Sac, or the Sacramento River, were in Chico's literally about a quarter of a mile from my house. I was like, man, I got to figure out how to guide here. And you had heard rumblings of people, it's a huge conventional fishery for salmon through the summer and fall. Gear guys out there fishing for sturgeon and the migratory stripers. And so people fished it, and I drove by it all the time, on the way in an hour and a half drive to somewhere else, usually to guide. And it always looked like there was some good sloughs and creeks and backwaters and stuff that may have some bass or carp in there. And I bought, I remember I borrowed about, I think it was $3,000, $4,000 from my dad. And I bought a little John boat with a prop on it, which looked a whole lot like I kind of call them the grumpy old man boats. And I was just like, man, if you're going to do it, let's do it. And I started going out there, and I very vividly remember, I'm showing up with this beater boat, prop boat, and I'm pulling into these boat ramps, and there's dudes with the 22-foot 250 tiller jet, and dragon row for salmon or flatfish, or throwing cut sardines for stripers. And this fly guy shows up with this little boat and a bunch of fly rods, and it was like an alien just landed at the boat ramp. And I started going out, and it was one of those things that, like, I still remember one of the first days I threw flies into, it's called Anderson Slough. It's this big open slough, and I threw flies, and it was like the bass had never even seen it. It was like very obvious it had never ever been fished with flies. And like after that day, I was just like, all right, man, this is my thing. Like, I got to figure this out. And the stripers were probably the last thing that I figured out. And I found that I could catch them in July and August. And what I started to figure out was that, like, these stripers actually live here. Like, there is a enormous resident population of stripers. And so to start with, I guided for them a couple months out of the year when I knew I could catch them. And when I started to do it more and learn more, I figured out how to catch them really now 365 days a year. And what has happened is the environment that these fish traditionally live and migrate through, which is the California Delta, and that bay estuary system, has really, really seen hard times when it comes to basically just the environmental health of the watershed. The striper's main food source in the Delta, which is the Delta smelt, is certified extinct. We've seen salinity increases. You'll get salt water all the way up into Stockton. And what you've really started to see is the stripers that once called the Delta home have now really stayed and established populations at both ends of that watershed. So now we have this incredibly healthy, thriving river population of stripers. And you also have seen, as surf fishermen in Monterey and Santa Cruz and these areas along the beach where they used to see stripers in the surf maybe 2 or 3 months out of the year are now seeing stripers in the surf 12 months out of the year because there's food there and the fish aren't leaving. So we've seen kind of both ends of the migration populations become very resident, and explode. And so as the fishery has grown over the years and kind of popularity, I definitely was the one that put some light on it and have, grown the business, so to say. But it is the fishery. It's one of the few fisheries that I can think of in California that's getting better. So, and it's kind of getting better because others are getting worse, but, is what it is, right?
It is, and maybe they'll deal with the delta issues, which is ongoing. But then maybe there could be two fisheries that are doing well. That's sorry.
Yeah, and I kind of think that you talk to a lot of old timers over the years, and I kind of think there always has been two fisheries. It's just no one really fished for the resident fish because I don't care where you are, but salmon is king where they are. And, until the last, say, 10 years, the Lower Sacramento River, you get salmon from July through December. So I've noticed if there's salmon around, that's all people care about. You know what I mean? And that's nothing wrong with that. That's, just the way it is. The conventional world, no fly guys really came down and tried to turn it into a viable, 6 to 12 months a year fishery. And the guys that were here fishing it were mainly conventional gear guys who were more interested in salmon. So I think it's always been here to some degree. It's just not until the fly guys really started showing up did it get more attention than it probably had prior. So.
And it's crazy. I mean, I've been around for 10 years.
Yeah.
And I was trying to find stripers, in like Santa Cruz and San Mateo County in the surf.
Yeah.
I went around parts of the bay trying to find stripers, and they're there, and I know where they are around Golden, Chrissy Field and stuff, and
yeah.
Fish the Delta, but otherwise, I've driven by Calusa in those areas. I don't know how many times to find other species while thinking about striped bass and thinking like, oh, there's Calusa, a duck town. Never once did it occur to me that there were more than ducks in Calusa. So this is...
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly diverse population of fish. I mean, there's fish that are, 6 inches long. There's hordes and buckets of fish that are 6 to 12 inches long every year that you're like, those fish are new fish. And then there's schools of fish that are in the 20 to 50 pound class. I mean, it is, and fish everywhere in between. It's an incredibly healthy population of fish, and there's massive amounts of food in the river, with all sorts of different bait fish, from pike minnows to sucker fish to bluegill to, fish that are, an inch long to a fish that are 6 inches long to fish that are 20 inches long, that these fish can eat and have lived in a good balance for as long as I think the stripers have been here. So, it's kind of I don't want to say it's a well-kept secret, as I think I think people know about it within the fly fishing world. It's by no means a fishery that your average person's gonna just go out and do. I mean, you have to have a jet boat. You have to kind of know how to drive a jet boat because it can be a little dicey. And it's not, stripers, if you fish for stripers, or you fish for any bass, they can turn off and on as hard and as quick as any fish I've ever fished for. You know what I mean? and they don't eat every day. And you kind of got to have some knowledge of the watershed and know where to be when, and know where to look when things are good and when things are tough, and kind of have your pulse on it, your finger on the pulse. But there's definitely dudes in Northern California that have bought in jet boats and really become recreational striper anglers because of the fishery and such. So I mean, it's out there. People know about it. It's just it's not a walk and wade trout river that you can buy a $150 fly rod and walk up to and get into it, so to say.
I want to talk more about food sources in a second, but before we do that, I'd like to hear as much history as we're aware of. If I recall, California received striped bass from New Jersey in like the early 1890s, 1891 or something like that. Where were those introduced, and how did that sort of lead to our current state of affairs in the state?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm by no means an expert on any of that type of stuff. So, as the listeners listen, don't take me as an expert, but basically I've tried to read and learn as much as I can, and I listen to people that are a lot more knowledgeable and smarter than I am, and at least so when people do ask me, I can talk moderately intelligently about it. But bass stripers were introduced, gosh, I mean, it comes 120, 140 years ago. And, you had an incredibly healthy at the time estuary system in the California Delta. It's basically where every freshwater source from the Grapevine to the California-Oregon border dumps into and then drains into San Francisco Bay. So if you look back, there's a really, if you turn into a really kind of California history nut, there's a great book called 2 Years Before the Mast, and it's a journal basically of a Harvard professor or a college professor. I want to say Harvard or Yale, one of the big timers back then, that drops out and jumps on a hide and tallow ship in the East Coast, sails around the Great Horn Spoon, and then sails up and down the California coast, picking up hide and tallow from the Spanish missions that were there. And this is before the gold rush, before any, basically Western Europeans had made it to California in any number. It's still part of Spain. And there's many great things in there that'll give you an idea of what California was like before, the influx of the gold rush and commercial agriculture and all that. But one thing that really always hit me as to how much the watershed has changed is his ship sails past basically the rocks that border the Golden Gate, what is now the mouth of San Francisco Bay, and they fill up their freshwater casks inside San Francisco Bay, which means there's so much water coming out of the California Delta and the river systems pushing out into San Francisco Bay that the water actually within San Francisco Bay was fresh water.
Wow.
And if you look now, you're looking at salinity or salt water up into the river systems into Stockton and the Sacramento area. So you've seen a system that 150 years ago was a freshwater estuary turn into a saltwater marsh. And in the tune of probably not 150 years, probably more like 60 years, with the advent of commercial agriculture and the growth of commercial agriculture in Central and Southern California. And so when you change an ecosystem like that, it changes everything. The Delta smelt that the stripers used to live on in that water is now extinct. So those stripers have had to find, and let's be real, bass species probably better than any others next to maybe the carp, adapt, right? They can adapt. And so they have had to adapt and find food sources in the river, in the ocean, where they can now live and thrive. And that has, in a lot of people's eyes, brought those stripers into competition with the salmon, which are native species, obviously, to our Pacific rivers and the Sacramento and the San Joaquin, all the rivers that flow into the Delta. And stripers, for a lot of, I guess, common folk, may be seen as enemies of salmon and stripers enemies of salmon and trout, because stripers eat baby salmon and trout in the river. But what a lot of the deep research done by UC Davis and some of the fisheries management things is you look at the history and the populations of striped bass and salmon, and they realistically ebb and flow in the same curves. Like our striper population is, as a general population, is declining, just like our salmon. Well, if you look at when those two populations were thriving, they were thriving when we had good water years. And salmon do well with water, stripers do well with water, and a lot of people in kind of a simplified version is when there's more water, there's more room for all the species to live happily in their own little zones, if you want to put it simply, right? When you start lowering the water, these fish become basically competitors for space and food. And so the attitude of stripers toward stripers over the last couple of years, maybe in certain populations, is kind of a little negative, just based on the fact that people have begun to assume that they eat salmon smolt or they eat trout, and they do to some degree, but a lot of that has to do with the management of the hatchery system and the management of the water that's pulled out of our rivers. So that's kind of the history and kind of where we're at with the species. But you really boil it down as stripers and salmon and trout, they all do well when we have water, and that's pretty common sense.
Yeah,
So.
it's funny. I've one argument I've heard, because there's certainly people who are anti-striper in California.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the counter arguments I've heard to that is that salmon and striped bass exist fairly well together in the Northeast, like in Maine or other areas. And so that might be an issue of water, like you were saying.
Oh, it's very much an issue of water. Like if you look at, there was a bunch of research done by, I forget his name, Peter Moyle, one of probably the most respected fisheries biologists in our state. He put together a graph where, for 60 years it overlays salmon populations, striper populations, and average rainfall. And when you look at it, extrapolated over that and overlaid, it becomes very obvious that the issue is not stripers or this or that. It is straight up water. When there's enough water for the farmers and enough water to put in the reservoirs, both the striper and salmon populations increase. When there's not, those populations decrease. And we're sitting on basically a couple years of drought. So you're seeing a decrease in salmon and striper populations as a whole. So it kind of makes sense with the historical data. It's when there's enough water, everybody does well. That's, that it's as commonsensical as that.
Yeah. And actually, now that I think about it, California was known for its salmon 60 years ago.
Absolutely.
And striped bass had already been here for 50 or 60 years at that point too. So it's not like the bass just got here and now the salmon are
No, it's and you talk to the old timer salmon guys, it's like the best salmon years, were not long ago. I mean, you're talking 10 years ago. Were some of the best salmon years 10, 15 years ago. Striper years were great then. That's when the Delta was the Delta, right? That's when, babyface John Sherman's catching, 110 and 15 pounders out in Discovery Bay every day. Like it, they can live together very easily if there is water.
I hadn't heard that nickname before, so it got me.
Well, if you ever look at those pictures,
Yeah.
he's got his John Lennon glasses on and his like, dad hat before he was a dad.
I hope he listens to this one on his own.
Oh, I hope he does too. He's John is a lifelong friend, and I've known him since we were in college. So I had nothing I wouldn't say to his face.
That's great. Getting back to these fish, you mentioned 50-pound striped bass. Are those resident fish or are those migratory?
Yeah. So
wow, they are.
Those fish live there. I mean,
wow.
we see one of our really good buddies. I will say his name is Paul. I will not Paul Young. Paul Young, we met, me and Chuck Reagan, my partner in guiding. We met Paul, I don't know, about 5-6 years ago, and Paul is a world champion spear fisherman. Paul holds the world record for spear shot striped bass, I think, in every water environment. So the guy's the real deal. There's not many people I know that like make a living as a spear fisherman. This dude travels all over the world, and of all the places this dude lives, he lives in Red Bluff.
No kidding.
And he spear fishes the river for stripers. And when I say he spear fishes, I mean, I bet Paul shoots maybe a fish or two a year. Okay. Like he's not, spear fisherman before I met Paul, got a very bad rap, but Paul, gear fishes when it's not spear fishing season. He fly fishes. He's just a waterman. The dude just loves fish. And Paul also will just dive the river and film. And when we met Paul, we knew there was big fish around. Like we caught big fish. We saw big fish. We knew they lived there because we caught them 365 days a year. Until we met Paul and really started seeing the stuff that Paul was seeing and filming, did we really have any idea of like how big the population of fish that we're dealing with in that river is. You got it. Paul knows the water from the bottom to the top and in between. And having someone that dives the river, first of all, to dive the river, you got to be absolutely insane, I think, personally. To throw a weight belt on and jump into the Lower Sacramento River. I mean, that's like how people kill themselves. And Paul does it for recreation. Wow. So, the dude can hold his breath for, I've seen him hold his breath for like over 2 minutes. Just an animal. And we started to really learn from Paul of what really was in there. And yeah, I mean, there's fish in there. I've seen fish that if somebody told me they were 60 pounds, I'd believe them they were 60 pounds. The biggest one that we've landed is 52. But, we get shots at fish in the 20 to 50 pound range pretty regularly. It is striper fishing for big fish in a river. Like the chances of it all going right is fairly slim based on the amount of stuff that is in the river. But yeah, I mean, there's giant fish in the Sacramento River. So
that's incredible. Yeah. So with fish like this, and especially in that river, which is a substantial river, what gear are you guys using?
Yeah, we fish 9 to 10 weights. We fish, braided core fly lines, which are really important. None of the mono core fly lines. We fish 25, 20-pound test. The thing that you got to be a little careful with is you get into the heavier sinking lines, you got to stay around that 18 to 20-pound test, because if you do hook a snag or something like that, any higher is hard to break off and get basically your fly line back, But But when we're throwing intermediate lines and stuff that's going to be higher up in the water column and we're fishing to the bigger fish, I mean, I don't have a problem throwing 30-pound or something like that, you know. Um, but, you know, the thing with the Sac is it's like the beauty of the Sac is it's, you know, I've never fished a fishery where on one cast you can hook a fish that's 12 inches and the next cast you can have a 50-pound fish following your fly to the boat, you know.
Yeah.
And I explain to people like that, you know, I don't do any other fishing. Like that's what I do. My kids really only know striper fishing. Like they've gone trout fishing a few times, but like, you know, you go to the Lower Sac to go trout fishing, or you go to the Lower Yuba to go trout fishing, and it's like, you know, a fish, like a fish you catch is 12 to 14 inches, and a trophy is like 22, you know, 23 maybe even, or 24, whatever. I mean, that's 12-inch difference at most. Like you kind of know what's in there. Like, you know, I've had fish that I catch that are, you know, 6 inches and you could put them in your aquarium, and the next cast I hook a fish that's the size of one of my children. It just, the gap of what you could catch between what is in there and what you do catch, I've never found that anywhere else. And it's just, that's hideously addicting from an angling point of view because of just what is the possibility, you know. And the big fish are there, you see them, I mean, you know, they're there. It's not like, you know, the Loch Ness monster that you never see. Like, you know, there on most days during the height of like the season or big fish season, like one guy in the boat's going to hook a big fish. And, you know, sometimes we hook 3 big fish. Sometimes we hook 4 big fish. Sometimes we hook 1 big fish and the guy pulls the fly out of his mouth, or, you know what I mean? Like, so just that chance keeps you going a lot of times. But, you know, you're also catching a ton of, you know, 2 to 10-pound fish, which I always tell people a 10 to 15-pound fish is like the perfect size. You know, anything over and you're going to get beat up pretty good, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah, I mean, everybody wants a big fish, but what they don't realize is you can't turn and handle a big fish like that on a 9 or a 10 weight rod, let alone a 12 or a 14 weight rod. And that fish is going to, you know, after it runs and goes ballistic where you caught it, that fish is going to go down in like 20 or 30 feet of water. And it's going to be like a, you know, a rodeo to get that thing off the bottom. And that's not fun. Believe me.
I had the best time catching, I call them false albies, but in Florida they call them, shoot, I can't remember now. They call them something else in Florida. It's going to drive me nuts. I'm going to remember after we've recorded. I'm focused on that. But I had the best time. I caught a bunch of them. I was so happy, and it was still morning. And I remember the guy I was with was like, "Hey, you want to catch some more?" And I was like, "No." It's like,
yeah, totally.
Not at all.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I mean, if you catch a big, I don't know, 20 to 50-pound fish, it's like, and, you know, let's be real, it's Northern California. I mean, you're going to be catching it either in the freezing cold or the blistering heat. Like, you know, we had a guy, I think last week, he hooked into like a 30-pound fish, and it was like 80 degrees, and, you know, he was great. But, you know, I think yesterday or day before it was, you know, 105, and a guy hooks a 12-pound fish and has to fight it. And, you know, he's dripping sweat like he just ran a freaking marathon, you know? So,
Right.
you know, it's hot out, and fighting big fish in the heat's not always easy. So, yeah.
Earlier you were talking about all these food sources, and so
Yeah.
I'd like to hear more about that, and then the flies that you use for this.
Sure. Yeah, so I find over my time out there that the biggest food source that our fish eat is what's called the pike minnow. It's I think it's the second largest minnow in the minnow family. They get anywhere, you know, there's a whole lot of 6 to 8 inch ones around, but you'll catch them up to like 30 inches and like 10 pounds. I mean, they get really big and they're voracious predators at that size. They're a native fish. They're a native predator to the Sacramento River. Um, they eat a lot of those. They eat a lot of what we would call sucker fish, the kind of yellow on the bottom, olive on the top, down mouth. A lot of people confuse them for a carp, but we call them sucker fish. They eat those. They'll eat bluegill. They'll eat crayfish. They'll eat baby bass. We have bass in the river, smallmouth and largemouth, that they'll eat. In the area, most of the areas that we fish for them are too warm for trout, so there is not a trout population to be preyed upon. They'll, during the summer months, migrate up into some of the areas of the river that have trout. The trout guides will start to see them a little bit, but trout and stripers don't really, in a normal situation, are not going to hang in the same water. A bass like a striper is not going to hang out in a riffle. They're just not built for that. They don't have the energy. They hunt the edges, the slower water, the weed beds. Every once in a while, they'll move into the deep holes to hunt if there's a reason to, but most of the time they're just kind of lazy and holding in the deep holes. So most of their food sources are stuff that's going to come off the edge, So those are the main ones that I found, and kind of the flies we use to imitate those. You'll catch fish on a chartreuse over white clouser with like hot pink sides, and I'm not sure that really imitates anything. We fish. Ryan Williams, one of our buddies, ties a really effective pattern. We fish a lot of olive over white stuff, olive over yellow patterns. I tend to find it's a whole lot less about like the color, but how that fly tracks through the water and how much water is displaced with that fly, meaning how bulky the fly is, how much water it pushes, which is really, relates to the size of the fly. And then, how that fly swims. You're dealing with current. So there is an element of presentation. A bait fish doesn't rip up river, So it's more about matching my experience about matching the size of what they're keyed on that day or that week than it is about like, it's got to be this color and this pattern. One big variation of that as well is how the fly is weighted predicates how that fly tracks through the water. So, like your typical lead-eye clouser is going to have that up and down jig to it. And that is not always what they want. They'll eat that some days, and some days they'll want a fly that moves through the water on a freaking rope, just straight line retrieve. So all our flies really, there's really three of us that guide it and do it on a regular basis. You have to tie your own flies. There's really no like commercially tied flies out there that are going to get the job done on a day-to-day basis. There's stuff that'll work, but I don't tie anything that is a commercial, or I don't fish anything that I don't tie out there. So, clousers and puglisi style flies, if you want to twist some up, are a good place to start. There's some local tires that'll sell flies. Ryan Williams sells some flies. Steve Adachi ties some great flies. Steve sells his flies through Lost Coast Outfitters, and Ryan sells his through his website. So, there's options out there, but a lot of it's just kind of, I think it's like fly fishing in general. One pattern will fish really well for one season, and then it doesn't catch fish ever again. And I couldn't tell you why. You know what I mean? So
yeah. Well, speaking of seasons, some of the things that I think about in that area are heat. Tons of rainfall certain times of the year. What are seasonal considerations people would want to make, even though you're really targeting not migratory, but resident fish?
Yeah. So, I would say the prime season is really kind of June through probably the first part of November. It's hot in June, but it's hot through most of that time period. California is weird, man. I mean, last week I was in bibs and a sweatshirt, and it was, 70 to 80 degrees in the first part of June. And this week, the last couple of days, it's been like 110. And I canceled 2 days because my clients, I didn't feel right taking them out in 110-degree weather, even though the fishing probably would have been fine. It just sucks fishing when it's that hot out. So we get those ebbs and flows. I mean, if you're coming up in the June, July, August, September, you got to be ready for the 90-degree to 100-degree heat. But that's also when the fish eat. Best fishing usually is during the hottest part of the day. And so it's, when the water starts to get colder and the conditions start to change in October and November, and we fish for them all the way through the winter. They just don't eat as much. Their metabolism's not moving as quick, and they just don't have to eat as much. So it becomes a little trickier game as you go into the fall and the winter. But if you do like cooler weather, usually October, November, we can still find pretty consistent bites. And by November, what we kind of start to run into is, that's when our winter starts traditionally. You start to get some of those first big kind of snow, Sierra snow and in California rainstorms that can blow out the river. So, we're fishing in areas where there's massive amounts of tributaries above us. And on a normal rain year, our river is going to blow out probably the end of November, first part of December, and it's going to be in and out of shape through April, on a good water year or even a normal water year. But a winter like we've had last winter, I mean, we fished all the way through the winter. The river never blew out. So, if you're more of a cold weather fisherman, December, January, and February can be good, but the fish may eat for 30 minutes during the day, but you're going to catch a lot of fish in 30 minutes, So the fish behavior, as I tell people, it kind of goes up with the temperature and goes down with the temperature. Usually the hotter, outside of those crazy hot days, if you can do 110, the fishing will be good. But when it's hot, fishing's good. So that's kind of the breakdown of the season.
Yeah. For those, right now it's like I can't wait to get back and go there.
Yeah, it's a cool fishery, man. A lot of I've never fished the Amazon, but I have a lot of guys that have fished peacock bass in the Amazon and stuff, and they say a lot of the areas we fish look exactly like the Amazon. So, yeah.
That's interesting. For me, when I'm back there and I want to go up there, I know how to get there, but even though I've passed through there so many times, I can't think of, for the general listener who's not from the area, how they would get there. What's the best way,
Yeah. So, if you're basically the Sacramento River, if you want to think of it in a generalized way, runs parallel to I-5, give or take 20 to 30 miles off to the east or west of I-5.
Sorry to jump in, I-5 is what jumps, runs north to south.
North to south. Yeah. You can take I-5, I'm pretty sure, from the Mexico border to the Canadian border. So I-5 is running basically north to south, right down the middle of the state. And, Chico's 20 minutes east of I-5, and you cross the river probably 10 miles. What would that be? I don't know, maybe 10 miles as you go across from I-5 to Chico. Calusa's probably 20 minutes off I-5. Red Bluff's right on I-5, and the river, I-5 crosses the river in Red Bluff. As you drop down into Sacramento, the town of Sacramento, you cross the Sacramento River again on its way into the Delta. If you keep going south, you cross the Sacramento River again in Stockton, and then it heads west out into the Delta. So, a lot of my clients come from the Bay Area or Sacramento, or if they're coming from Southern California or out of the area, they'll fly into Sacramento Airport, and Sacramento Airport's about an hour and a half from where we are in Chico. Chico's a small little college town. It's got Chico State in it. Very similar to an Ashland, a Eugene, or really any college town I've ever been to. And, Got a Sierra Nevada brewery in town and some nice stuff to do. So it's kind of a fun place to spend a few days if you're from out of town.
One of the things you're also involved in is the California Bass Union. Tell us about that.
Yeah, yeah. So, when you're a fly fishing guide in an area where there's not a whole lot of fly fishing guides, like a striped bass guide on the Lower Sacramento River or whatnot, like um, you kind of gravitate to other people in the fly fishing community that do what you do. And my partner and I, Chuck Reagan, who's lives in Grass Valley and touring musician and bass guide as well. We're like, we really got to promote like all this stuff we do. Most people in the fly fishing world don't know about, spotted bass fishing on Lake Oroville and Shasta and Bullards, or striper fishing on the river. And kind of like you said, how many people, drive by all this stuff to get somewhere to go trout fishing. If you drive from San Francisco to, say, the Lower Sac and Reading to go trout fishing, you drive by, in the BASS world, probably, I think, like 3 to 4 of the best bass fisheries in the world, just that you don't even know, or fly fish. So we kind of decided, like, this is an element of the sport that, like, we should make people aware of, because it's great. Bass are everywhere, whether it's striped bass or largemouth bass or smallmouth bass. And as trout and steelhead populations become more stressed and more people start to fly fish, like, what's better than spreading out and introducing people to really some of the most prevalent game fish in our country, or at least in our state.
Yeah.
So
sorry, I was just gonna say, no one's gonna threaten to murder you.
Absolutely.
Like some of these steelhead spots. And yeah, I got your
Yeah,
note.
it just kind of made sense. And so we got a bunch of our buddies who are bass guides together. Alex Cady down in San Diego, our dear friend John Sherman in the Delta, Mike Costello, kind of the legendary striper guide in the Delta, who I was fortunate to come up under as a fishing guide. Ryan Williams, who actually competes in professional bass tours with a fly rod.
Oh,
And
cool.
Matt Callies, who's just kind of this huge bass fisherman, also just a crazy innovative guy. We call him the mad scientist.
Big tire,
And
right?
yeah, big tire, just kooky dude and dear friend. And we're like, hey, let's get all these guys together, create this organization, and just start sharing what we do, teaching people how to bass fish, where to bass fish, and really kind of as guides, not really interested in booking trips or doing anything. Like, we just kind of figured that would come if you share what you do and the goodwill and get people doing different things, because that's kind of how you grow the sport. And yeah, so if you check out calbassunion.com, you'll see all sorts of videos and instruction and blog posts, and information about all these guys doing different types of bass fishing throughout the state of California and trying to grow and promote it in the sport of fly fishing. So
That's great. And
yeah,
I don't know if it'll come out in the audio, but I joked, I got your note after I said threatened to murder you, but that happened. Like, if you say too much about steelhead, it's like almost like Fight Club.
oh yeah, no, like we even, we jokingly made stickers for the Cal Bass Union that says, save wild, or protect wild steelhead, fly fish for
That's
bass.
great. And you can just openly talk about it and, help people and help them
Totally.
get into their game without there being, angry people
Yeah, I
or
mean,
whatever.
yeah, I mean, I pull up on at Lake Orville in December to guide for spotted bass, and if there's 30 boats there, I could care less. If you
Right.
pull up on the eel, the South Fork of the Eel, and there's 30 boats on it, people are getting shot. you know,
Yeah.
so it's just, I mean, it in California, the trout and steelhead, it's not getting better, and it's hideously stressed. And you know, we have some of the best bass fishing in the world that fly fishermen, very few of them actually partake in. And it just seems like a lot of guys are missing the boat, you know. So we decided to open the doors and share it with the world as best we could. So it's something we're passionate about and we love. So we may be just crazy. It's just a few rebel weirdos that like it, but most people that we introduce to it enjoy it. So
That sounds great.
yeah.
You, you've been a natural on this podcast, but there's good
Oh,
reason for
thanks, man.
that. There's good reason for that. So you're one of the hosts of the Barbless Podcast.
I am. Yeah. So I got the Barbless Podcast. I joined the Barbless Podcast. You know, Nick and Chad have done a great job with it. They get a lot of really interesting guests and come up with very dynamic, scientific based guests and stuff. And I told them, I said, you know, I really just want to bring some of my friends on and talk about fishing and raising kids and just kind of the random culture of fly fishing. And they seem to think that was a good idea and people enjoy them. So yeah, I host the Barbless Podcast, and you know, like any of us, the fly fishing industry is a pretty small world, but you get to meet a lot of really cool people and really interesting people doing really interesting things. And that's kind of what I try to share with my listeners on the podcast, is just people in the industry that are doing different and cool and interesting stuff, you know. And I think that's how we grow the sport, is by sharing those ideas, whether it's on tying flies, buying boats, fishing for this, or, you know, yeah, just the relatable experiences that we all have. So,
well, you're certainly doing interesting things. Where can folks go to learn more about what you're up to?
Yeah. So they can check out my website, hdbflyfishing.com. They can find me on Instagram at hdbflyfishing, or Facebook, or I think I have a Twitter, but I don't really look at it that much. I'm pretty active on Instagram and sharing stuff under the Cal Bass Union Instagram, which is at Cal Bass Union and stuff. So yeah, if anybody's interested, you know, I'm an open book. Call me, email me. You can email me at hoganbrown@hotmail.com. I think I'm the only human being with a Hotmail email address still.
Wow. This is all about, like, you know, innovating and doing new things, and then you drop a Hotmail address at the end.
Dude, I know. Like, I don't know what it, like, I have Gmail. Like, I got a Gmail address. Like, it just doesn't, it like, it doesn't make sense to me. It does, you know, there's certain computer programs. I'm like, I spend a lot of time on a computer doing marketing stuff and such like that. But like, Gmail it just does it, you know, it's like Chinese. I'm just like, dude, this just doesn't work for me. So yeah, I mean, I got every Mac product in the world, and I like to think of myself as top single digit % on computer literacy and like knowing what the heck's going on, but I'm still rocking the Hotmail. So,
oh,
you know.
And I don't want people to forget, what's your MySpace?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I had a friend for a long time. I will not mention his name, but he's also a very reputable fly fishing guide in the state of California who had an AOL.com.
There you go.
Right? Like, and he gave up the AOL.com, and I was like, all right, man, I may be the last one with the ancient email addresses. So
that's funny.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming on, and I enjoyed that laugh at the end, and this was great, and you know, hopefully we can chat again soon.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And if anyone needs anything, reach out, and we'll be happy to steer you in the right direction. So take care.
Sounds good. Thanks.